Hello, that next. This is Federico from Argentina. Sadly, this time we cannot meet locally for the reasons that we all know. So this time I'm going to bring you an entirely different type of talk. You remember my talks were mostly about very technical stuff, but today we are going to bring you something differently. Over time, you will see that the very same things that actually make sense for there's like a continuum of ideas that actually make sense. So the very first question that everyone should be asking right now, and when you saw the actual talk that I'm going to be giving, is what the hell is a performance guy doing in Virusland? Because let's face it, it's kind of strange. Because you all know me for something different. But the thing is that if the only thing that you know how to do is measuring stuff, guess what? Yeah, we are going to continue measuring stuff. So the interesting thing about epidemiology is that it is the study and analysis of the distribution, patterns, and determinants of health and disease conditions in defined populations. What are distributions? Essentially, you go measure and you find a distribution of things. What are patterns? Patterns are things that arise from having go to measure stuff. So if you think about it, epidemiology is about essentially measuring how populations and how, in this case, viruses, but it could be another type of generation and pathology. So if you think about it, it's like the very best thing and the most important thing that it has to be done in epidemiology is measuring, because from measurements you can actually get something else. So yes, measurements, and this is it. We are going to be talking about how to measure SARS-CoV-2. So understanding the epidemic behavior and modeling of infectious diseases, in this case SARS-CoV-2, is one of the things that I have dedicated my last year in an independent work with Lev and the Javascripts. So what we are going to be showing today is some of the outcomes of our work and how we ended up there, and giving you a primer on the techniques that has to be done in order to measure this kind of stuff and essentially not making wrong or very, very wrong forecasts. So and why do I mention this? Because essentially when you are in front of a live epidemic, what you wanted to understand is what's gonna happen. And the problem is forecasting is crazy hard, like crazy hard. And I wouldn't say that we hit every forecast that we did, because essentially there are so many moving parts that it's almost impossible. So the idea of this talk is actually giving you the tools to figure out when forecasts make sense and where forecasts do not make sense at all. So there are like a basic group of things that you have and you are able to do to figure out if some forecast makes sense. So as a first part, I'm going to add a disclaimer here. So, this talk is rate H for hardcore, but in this case, it's gonna be hardcore for an entirely different reason. So, obviously, this type of stuff, if you're not in biostatistics or any other close thing, it's not gonna make more. It's not gonna be something that you will be able to do anytime soon. But most important, because the topic itself is sensitive. So eventually at some point in the talk, that it's in part 3, we are going to be talking about the actual live epidemic we're in. When you realize that the kind of data that you are dealing with is essentially every single tick, every single number that you have in there actually means someone. So epidemiologists are like, they have to get with that. They have to live with that, because that's their job, is to figure out, hey, you know, how can we respond better under certain circumstances that are very, very far from being like the best thing that the best situation that you're in. So in this sense, I'm going to tell you part 2 is pretty more theoretical in a sense, but if you figure out that by 5 at part 3 this talk is not for you, it's okay. Obviously there's no any graphic, there's no graphic sensitive material in here, so the only thing that we are going to be talking about is data, but the data itself is sensitive in its content. And also, well, forecasting is really, 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 really hard. It's like, if someone actually hits a forecast, is something that should be applauded, because, yeah, you know, it's very, very difficult. So let's talk about the fundamentals. We are going to be talking something entirely different here. We are going to be talking on how do we evaluate evidence? Because, you know, when you're measuring a CPU, when you're measuring memory, when you're measuring memory behavior, whatever, what you're doing is actually, you have a program and, you know, you can go to Andre's book and figure out, hey, you know, I cannot do this because I'm going to be complicating this other thing, and I'm going to get noise in this way and the other. But when you talk about like human stuff, or viruses or bacteria or diseases, essentially, the evidence is not so clear cut. So not evidence is created equal, and if you look at it, this is more or less how it is structured. You have background information and expert opinion in the bottom. Then you have case control studies and reports, but you know, these are like, I'm going to get 3 people look at what happened. I'm going to do something that this is kind of observational studies. Then you will have cohorts. You will say, okay, I'm going to be separating like 60% young people from older people and see what happens. Then you're entering into the actual really good kind of evidence, which is randomized controlled trials, where you are going to be given a standard care, for instance, to a group of people that is very, very well it's very well sampled, so you know that you're not introducing or trying not to introduce problems in your groups, and then you're going to be given to one of the groups the new drug or treatment that you want to try, and the other one you are going to be kept them on a standard care. So this is essentially probably the best kind of evidence that you can generate into a single study. Then on top of that is the actual systematic reviews of those studies, and we can probably do a workshop on the problems that can be introduced in systematic reviews. So it's not something that should be taken lightly. But the point of why do I bring this, which is something that we are not going to be talking about, is because the following: whenever you hear something, it's usually clear. So it's pretty difficult to get good evidence. And whenever an expert says, hey, you know, this is because of this or this is that, this is an expert opinion. An expert opinion in the evidence lines is worth 0. You have to go to the sources. You have to figure out if the sources are good. You have to understand if the information actually makes sense. So you can extract what is useful as evidence and then work from there. So let's talk about a little bit about models, shall we? So I like this quote because it's essentially the simplest definition that you can get. A model is a group of equations where you can choose what it is data and what it is unknown. And this is important because, you can define the group of equations and you can do whatever you want in there. But at some point you have to decide, hey, what's data and what is what I want to know. So it's not as simple as just go with it. So models are abstractions of processes, and those equations actually mean something. But before actually going into the equations themselves, how do we know if we're modeling the right thing? If we are overfitting into what we think is the root cause of something? How we are even able to understand if our theories, because if we're modeling something, is because we have an underlying theory in there, is correct. Or how do we calibrate? If everything, let's assume that our models what we want, it's capturing, it's not overfitting and everything, then you have the problem of the data. Garbage in, garbage out. So if you put the wrong data, you are in problem. So your calibration is important. For instance, this is an example, it's a classic example of overfitting. Say, hey, we have these observations, these samples, and then you will find a 7th degree polynomial fitting for it, and which is the green line. We have here. And the problem is that it breaks down because this was actually generated from a process that generated a straight line using a 1st degree polynomial. So while this is a simple thing and you can actually see it and understand it, overfitting actually is quite subtle. So the more free parameters that you have, or the more non-linear your systems are, the worse. So, this is one of those problems when you will never know if you are right until it's too late. If you're this is the key here. You have an induction problem. You don't even know if what you think is what is going to happen tomorrow, but you are going to be doing something, believing that tomorrow is gonna behave as you expect. So when you design a public response to something, it may be it's also generating modifying the behavior of your system. So induction gets pretty difficult in those systems. The other thing is understanding if we're actually modeling the right thing, because complex systems, you may be simplifying something because you cannot, if you want to model real life in all its complexity, essentially you have to create a universe because you're not able. So you have to simplify. So there's no option. And the simplification that you use to describe the system actually makes a difference in how you understand the system. So can we measure the difference between predicted and measured values? So sometimes it's not so easy. So we need to understand that our measurements require certain level of characteristics that are important, like being trustworthy. If you have something that you're using for measuring something, and then someone goes and changes, for instance, the way they are measuring that, your measurements are now going to be trustworthy. So you have to also understand, hey, this measurement that I'm doing is actually unbiased, or it has bias, and it has bias on which direction, and that direction, how will impact a nonlinear solution? Who knows? Also, they have to be representative. If I have a disease that is like SARS-CoV-2 that has a very, very age-based profile, so it's not the same disease for someone below 20 years old that's for someone over 60 years old. So if I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to measure the fatality ratio, and I do it on less than 20 years old, I'm going to find an absolute zero. This disease is not a problem. But, that's not a representative sample. So you need to be certain that the measurement that you take actually is able to capture that representative space. And the other problem is that you have to understand and be able to know if the measurement itself is free of systematic observational error. And that's not small. Also, we need to understand if our calibration is correct. And this is something that is very important. When we measure, what are we really measuring? So say I tell you, I'm measuring cases. Yes, you're measuring cases, but how do you decide what a case is? Do you go to do PCRs, or you go to the hospitals and figure out, hey, this guy has a bilateral pneumonia, and then you are going to do something. So how you sample is gonna give you. So if alone this selection of cases, for instance, alone can break a model without you even knowing it, because cases is such that a measurement that you should never ever think of any case-based model if they are not trying to figure out something regarding the cases. So if you want to understand epidemiology, so how it's gonna behave, and you're using cases, you're doing it wrong. So one important thing here is, well, all models are wrong. Some are useful, but the most important takeaway here is that the rest are garbage. Because if you cannot input the right data in there, you're bad. You're doing it wrong. So the questions may be awesome, may be very, very descriptive, but if the data is wrong, it's bad, you're going to get something that doesn't reflect life, doesn't reflect what you actually want to model. So let's talk specifically about what it means to model SARS-CoV-2, because there are many answers. Many questions that we can ask, and there are really not many clear-cut answers for that. So someone can think, hey, I want to understand if asymptomatics are contagious, or I want to understand what is the mode of transmission. So I go and measure how the transmission happens and then do a model for that, whatever. So some people like Ioannidis, and Gideon Merriward-Katz want to understand the lethality by age, for instance. And it's great, and they build models specifically to understand that. Are there going to be second waves? This is the question that we ask ourselves. So our question, the question that we wanted to have answered at the time is, are there going to be second waves? And the other thing is, does an optimal response actually exist? This is another question that we made ourselves. After we figure out the second waves, we say, okay, but what can we do about this? So we set up to investigate these issues on July of 2020, and we essentially responded by the 13th of October, before the second waves started in Europe. So when modeling complex systems, one of the key things that you have to know is that induction just fails. And because it fails, we need to understand what most scientists do not realize is science is about proving yourself wrong, not right. I'm doing a disservice to myself if I'm trying to prove me right. What I have to be doing constantly is trying to find new evidence that actually can prove myself, my work, wrong. So, because the more that you strengthen, the more that you try to break your own model, the more you harden that model against real life. So, for doing this, there's one key tool in your toolbox, which is modustollens. For those that are not more that into logic, this is actually very useful for performance stuff. So I've been using this forever. And it's pretty good that I can actually bring this to the table today. So the idea of modustollens is, it comes from Latin. It means it's the mode where you deny, but by denying, you deny. So essentially, this is the logic proposition. So you say, okay, if P implies Q, but in this case, but it is the case of not Q, I can show you somehow that not Q is true. Then we can conclude by just this assertion that not P is true. This has huge implications, because what this means is you always have the high ground. Whenever you are trying to decide if an assertion is true, and you can find that single counterexamples that it kills that assertion, you know that that assertion is not true and it needs work. How that works? Let's do an example of it. So let's say that I have a theory. So I'm gonna claim that obesity is a major factor in deaths of SARS-CoV-2. And think about this. I'm saying SARS-CoV-2. I'm not saying COVID-19, which is the disease. So let's look at the evidence, okay? So we go to the Czech Republic. And we see that obesity rate is 26%, with 2,600 something deaths per million. Well, we need something else we can compare, right? So we go to Switzerland, where the obesity rate is way lower. It's 19.5. And actually, they got less than half the deaths per million. So then we look at Argentina. And here we have our first red flag. Because, 31% obesity rate, and we're roughly around Switzerland. And then we look to Norway. This is like, hey, wait. 23%, but only 126 deaths per million. And then we have Egypt with 32 and 120. By this time, something is off here. So we are going to be looking at it. So obesity is a major factor. So that's our P. So that's our assertion. If P, then we need to see that the deaths of SARS-CoV-2 have to have a relationship. Probably the higher the obesity rate, the higher the death. We show that in the very first two examples. But what happened? It started going backwards afterwards. So when you actually go and look at Egypt with 32% and only 120 deaths per million, you have a not Q. So the problem with here is that now you cannot claim that obesity is a major factor. So we can conclude without risking to be wrong, and this is important, that the assertion as it is, it's not correct. But, there is always a but in here. So nothing is ever so clear-cut. So the problem is that matpat theory may be just plain wrong, and know it. It's usually the most likely case. You are going to be throwing a million hypotheses in there, and they are not going to stick. They are going to die in the process of analyzing this. So most of your ideas are wrong. Deal with it. But then comes the problem. It's like, hey, I cannot actually show that it's plain wrong. And the reason why I cannot do so is because, you may just be unable to explain the variance in there. So it's actually a confounder. You can actually see correlations in there. But, we have these off cases here and there that doesn't add up. Worse than that is that you may actually be right, but only at a second or third order contribution. So actually, the driving factor is not that one. Or it may be the driving factor at some point in time, but not at the next. So your actual theory is actually incomplete because your P must account for, it's the driving factor in summer. It's not in winter, for instance. So the other case is, I may be having an underspecified Q. Q is ambiguous. So, Q may be like, hey, we can measure it like this, or we can measure it like that. If you do it this way, you get this number, and if you do it this other way, you do it in a different way. So Q may be ambiguous. But probably to me, the worst case scenario is that P and Q are subjected to systematic observational error. And the problem is that this kind of problem is actually very, very difficult to get rid of. And this also happens when you're measuring memory behavior. It's horrible. So let's do an example of what a systematic observational error looks like. So say you have a surveillance system. So surveillance system is something that you do if you want to, for instance, track influenza. So you have these hospitals that are working as surveillance places. So you always measure at the very same place. You always measure in the same randomized way. So you actually get a randomized population sampling. So you choose people along the space in such a way that you are actually being able to, have a clear representation of the entire location that you're studying. And then you select a group of those cases that are actually, typically what you do is you actually have as many, and you try not to change that number match in order to be able to have like every time the same amount. So what happens here is that you have 10 years of data. So you have been doing this surveillance for 10 years, and you always have a positivity around 10%. What that means, I send it to the lab, and the lab say, hey, this guy came here because of influenza-like, with influenza-like symptoms, and I'm going to test it for influenza. And 1 out of 10 comes positive for influenza, either A or B or whatever. So now here comes the problem, because some particular year you have an abnormal spike in cases, and this is why I say cases. This is the wrong metric to deal with this. Say you have an abnormal spike. So you normally have 100,000, and then you got 1 million. That's 10x. Then you send that measurements to the lab for confirming, because you're getting your randomized population sampling and blah, 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 and you're doing everything right because you're doing surveillance, and the results are back. And it is compatible with your history, 10%. So let's put it in a way. So if from 100,000 cases we send 2,000 to the lab and 10% of the cases are influenza, then we would expect that 10,000 cases are expected to be influenza, and 90,000 are expected to be untypified influenza-like diseases. So if you get 10%, there's no abnormality in there. So then we send that million cases. From those million cases, we send 2,000 to the lab, and we get 10% of the cases are influenza. So from 1,000, so then you have 1,000 cases which are expected to be influenza, and 900,000 that are expected to be untypified influenza-like diseases. So my question to you is this year compatible with history? Which translates into, can we conclude there is no abnormality in there? And what I'm going to do is we are going to hold this and we're going to pass to part 3, and then we are going to come back to this question. So stay there. So on part 3, we are going to be talking about modeling actually SARS-CoV-2 using our technique, which is explicitly is a 40 pages report that it's called SARS-CoV-2 Waves in Europe, a 2-stratum SEIRS model solution. So you can actually go and read it. So we are going to be given some important definitions here. Some I said here, but before, but I want them to be available here for you, so you can actually then look at them in case you need it. We are going to be talking about SARS-CoV-2, which is an RNA virus from the beta coronavirus genus, and we're going to be separating that from COVID-19, which actually the group of signs and symptoms which define the disease caused by the virus. We are going to be talking, and this is important, of PCR positives. PCR positives are individuals with samples positive for RNA sequence of SARS-CoV-2 by polymerase chain reactions, which is entirely different to be antibody positive, which is actually being positive to antibodies specific to SARS-CoV-2, either IgG or IgM. So we have to also separate between humoral immunity, which is the immunity conferred by antibodies, so that's what you measure with the AB positive, and cellular immunity, which is actually mediated by T cells. And we also have to be very, very clear what a seroprevalence study is. A seroprevalence study is a study that allows you to measure the prevalence of antibodies positive individuals at a population level, which means I'm going to go to measure the level of antibodies, the amount of people that actually have antibodies to the virus, has been in contact and is already infected or have been infected before. Then we have to be talking about infected, which is an individual carrying SARS-CoV-2 during the infectious period, which is entirely different to the case. A case is a PCR positive individual detected or suspected by epidemiological criteria, which means I go to the hospital, I have a dry cough, I have a viral pneumonia, probably I'm SARS-CoV-2 positive. So, and then you have the R0, which is the basic reproduction number, which is from every infected, how many new infectors you are going to be having in the population thanks to me as an infected. And also talking about asymptomatic individuals. Asymptomatic individual is someone that has a PCR positive with unequivocal symptoms of COVID-19, which is the disease, not the virus. And a presymptomatic is a PCR positive individual which will be symptomatic in the future, not now, but it's gonna be on a reasonable time frame. Don't tell me a month, because I tell you that guy was not presymptomatic. That guy got it later. The mild symptomatic, on the other hand, is a PCR individual that has non-unequivocal symptoms. So this kind of of individuals actually many times are not even detected. And asymptomatics are PCR positive individuals without symptoms for the disease. A suspected death, and this is important, is an individual death which meets the definition of symptoms for COVID-19, but is not PCR positive. That's a confirmed death. And a clinically confirmed death is a symptomatic individual death. So it has to be PCR positive, it has to have the symptoms, and it has to have died. NPIs are non-pharmaceutical interventions. When you social distance, when you close schools, when you use masks, essentially you are applying non-pharmaceutical interventions, because the pharmaceutical ones are treatments. I'm going to be dosing dexamethasone. I'm going to be giving you whatever. That's an actual pharmaceutical intervention. Then we're going to be talking about cohorts. Cohorts are a population segment with a specific characteristic. In our case, we are going to be talking about older than 60 and younger than 60 which are healthy. So What our model is a compartmental model, which is a simplified mathematical model of an epidemic behavior. There are two types of those that you need to know. There are homogeneous models and heterogeneous models. The idea is that for the homogeneous models, which is the kind of model that we are using, individuals share the same parameters along the cohort. Then you have SEIRS models, and AVM. We are going to be talking about SEIRS specifically and SEIRS type, but it's interesting to know that AVMs are agent-based models, which are simulation-based. We actually have if you're actually interested in Appendix 3, we have a result that is very, very on topic for AVMs. So the two-stratum SEIRS model, which is actually the kind of model that the model we built, is a two parallel feed-forward compartmental SEIRS model. I know, it's a mouthful. Don't worry, we are going to be explaining what that means. And also it's an age stratified with two cohorts. We are talking about healthy under 60, and we are going to be talking about the vulnerable. So those are the over 60 and also the under 60, which are not healthy. So those can actually be estimated. The model explicitly models NPIs through averaging, which is, for those that are more interested into the mathematics behind this, is the idea is similar to the mean field theory. So you get this huge parameter space. Then what you do is you average and you reduce the amount of parameters. So you essentially wanted to keep only the most important. So you average them out. So it's a method for dimensional reduction. So in our model, which is very, very different from every other model that you will see around there, we are fixing both location and vital parameters. Those are fixed, and it's interesting because if you say, hey, I'm going to have this epidemic model, which has the ability to, should have the ability to understand how the host and the virus moves during the epidemic, and you fix the parameter for both, it kind of doesn't make much sense, okay? So you're going to see why it matters later. So the objectives that we had, it was estimated total immunity on naive populations. So to put it in another way is, do we have enough susceptible people to actually fuel another way? To fuel a second or a third or fourth or whatever way. And the other objective that we had, which was posterior later, is to disambiguate the epidemic behavior. Because we looked at Stockholm and we look at Madrid, and you look at the series and they look alike, but they are nowhere near similar. So the basic SEIRS model is this set of equations. So you have the susceptible, the exposed, the infected, and the recovered, and you have a fixed population, and you have a transmission rate, which is, hey, how many of the susceptibles are going to be transitioning into the infected, or the latency when someone has been in contact with the virus, how much time it takes for it to transition into infected, or also the recovery rate is how many are gonna recover from this. So it looks like this. So we have the susceptible, we have the exposed, we have the infectious, we have the recovered, and we have the equations. So this equation is actually showing that. And this other equation is saying, hey, these are the exposed. So we are going to be dealing with the infected and the susceptible, and we are going to get this new number at the next step for the exposed. The same thing happened at the level of the exposed and infectious. And obviously, in the case of the infectious, at some point you will have to recover. Some recovered and some don't. Well, it's important for us to actually understand how many on this side, on each side there is. The two-stratum model is a little bit more complex because essentially what you have is two of those, where you have that you're susceptibles and you're exposed and infectious and recover for under 60, healthy under 60, and you have your susceptible, you're exposed, you're infectious, and you're recovered on the vulnerable side. But then you have cross-isolation between the two. So how those, in a sense, is the rank 2 matrix that models the contact between the two groups. So that's cross-isolation. And on the other side, you have the average isolation for each one of those, which those are the parameters. It's like, you remember that I said in the mean fields, you are going to be averaging out. Well, isolation is the average of how people moves in society. So you can actually understand how, essentially how much pressure you are putting onto the virus for him to not spread. If you look at it programmatically, it's something like this. And the reason why I'm showing this is because you can actually look at the Javascripts code from the simulator, and you will find every single of these things. It's a little bit more complex because we have a lot of more stuff that you can actually go and look, and you will figure out which part is which part after this. But what you're seeing here is essentially how everything links together. So we are back to a model is a group of equations that you now know, where you can actually choose what it is the data and what it is unknown. So now let's talk about the data. So data is important because essentially what you will have there is like, it's gonna define what kind of disease you are modeling. So if I say, hey, you know, the vital parameters are the data, so we decide that they are not unknowns. We have to go to the evidence to find what are those parameters. So if you go out there, you can find estimations for the R0 of the virus that goes from 2.5 to even 5, but the consensus is it's around 3.3. So we actually took the highest number from the consensus. Then you can have the time, the D0, the E0, which is the exposed, the time that usually happens between you're exposed to you have symptoms or you are infected. But the most important here is the vulnerable IFR, which is the infection fatality rate. Is if you have a population of 100 and 100 of the vulnerable get infected, on average, 1 is gonna die. But if you go into the IFR from the non-vulnerable, and you can actually look at tables, you can actually go and to the Diamond Princess, you can go to the New York data, and you can actually figure out that the number for the non-vulnerable, which are the below 60 that do not have any comorbidity whatsoever, is so low that you need actually 1,000 people to find 3. That's in that category. And then you have other things like how many people do you have that cannot isolate, for instance. So I live with my grandpa, so I cannot actually isolate from my grandpa. If I don't do it, if I have to go to work, then I'm unable to isolate. If I can work from here with the computer and I have to go out, I'm able to isolate, okay? Or if he lives in a different house, I'm able to isolate from him. So the locations parameters are also data, which is population at risk. So if you're saying, hey, you know, if you look at the profile says, if the risk is actually high for over 60 and with comorbidities, then that's your population at risk. Also, the reported daily series. These are important because not every death series is the same. So you can actually have to look into, hey, you know, I have this death series that is reported by report date or by date of death. And the problem in there is that there are entirely different series and they have entirely different characteristics. And one of those is wrong to be used in epidemiological models, and the other one is right. the one that is right is actually the deaths by day of death, not when you reported it. For analysis of the lag of reporting, it may be useful, but not for the epidemiological part. And also the seroprevalence ratio. This one is huge. I'm not going to be explaining it here because we are going to be explaining it later. So the unknown for us, essentially, is the total number of infected individuals from a fully naive population, which means if this doesn't work, this model doesn't work if the population is not naive. You have to account for that. So we are assuming, big assumption, that this virus hasn't been in the population before. So the reason, the question is, can we forecast now with all the things that we see? We have all of that. Can we forecast? And the question is no. And the reason we cannot go to the forecasting part of the talk yet is because, well, you have the three parameters. So the model was designed, in our model was designed to be fitted. So you can actually get the death series. And then we have to figure out, hey, what are the proper parameters that actually describe the part of this, the part of the epidemic that we have seen before. So that's the reason why you want fitting, because if your model should be able to forecast, it should always be able to approximate the behavior that you already seen. So the question is, what data should we fit, or what parameters should we use? So the point of avoiding having three parameters like the plague, and no pun intended here, is like, you know, the more free parameters that you have, the more non-linearity that you have available at your disposal. So the better you can overfit into it. So the question is, virus and location parameters are not free parameters. They shouldn't be free parameters because they are like 100. So you don't want those as free parameters because essentially you could model whatever. In the case of the true stratum free parameters, what we did is like, we are going to be describing every place that we study using just two parameters, which is the average isolation for the vulnerable and the average isolation for the healthy. Those are essentially the non-pharmaceutical intervention levels that you apply to your entire population. So we are going to be fitting a demo here so you can actually understand what I mean. So let's say that I'm not going to be applying any isolation to anyone on Madrid. This is our actual curve, the part of the epidemic that we have already seen, and this one is the part that we expect it to be with no isolation. So whenever we say, hey, you know, I'm going to be isolating a little bit the vulnerable, we are going to be saying, hey, you know, 5. No. So essentially what it means is that we are going to be isolating, we are going to be cutting in half the amount of contact that this cohort, the vulnerable cohort, has with the virus. So you see how it changed, okay? But the thing is, you know, but I need to apply, like I'm going to be closing the schools. But the problem here is that this is very, very, very difficult to get right. And the more parameters that you have, it's more difficult. A parameter that typically is used is this one, which is how many infected you get on the first day. This parameter is important because you can vary that and say 2 and see how the curve changes. So this is very, very difficult. So what we did is to figure out, hey, you know, we can actually say, hey, you know, we fix one and we find the one that closest, that approximates the better the behavior from the other one. So in this way, you can actually try as many combinations as you want and then go and figure out, hey, you know, yes, this makes sense. So we are going to come back to this. So the problem that you have here is that you saw that second way, but there is a problem. The system actually has a very interesting behavior. So you can see here the fitted deaths. They are all equal. And you can see the isolations from each cohort. Now they relate to each other. See? And then you can say, hey, you know, there's a cube fitting here. So there are infinite, and I really mean it, infinite alternatives to this. We're going to get the same fitted deaths. And the question I ask to you is, which one is right? We don't know. So, because the problem is that you have here and you have 0.5 versus 0.84. So essentially you have very hard isolation on the elderly, on the vulnerable. And then you can describe the same thing. See, it's roughly the same thing with far more isolation for the healthy than for the vulnerable. Interesting, because now I can I can change it the other way around. Hey, you know, I can describe the same system, and I can do it all the other way around and say, hey, you know, I'm going to really care about the vulnerable, but I'm not going to do almost anything with the healthy except closing the stadiums. So okay, not full match for you guys, and you're going to describe more or less the same system, give or take. But so with this, are we there yet? No, clearly not. Because, you know, if we have this problem, if we can describe this system in different ways, how do we know we have the case of the this case, essentially, the case of on the left, or the case on the right? We don't know. And the interesting thing about this is that if you look at the actual final deaths after this finish, because at this point you have accrued this amount of deaths, you can actually see that there's a huge chunk, because we have said that up to this point there was 8,900 something, and then you are going to 13 and the other one is going to 16, so you're talking about 3K more. And the interesting thing here is that, hey, you know, we are going to be putting an interval. We are going to be doing some sampling here. We are going to do some Monte Carlo. And we are going to try to understand what's the variability, right? That would sound awesome, right? Yeah. The problem is not so easy. Look at this. If you actually do not isolate the vulnerable, you isolate the vulnerable hard, and you don't isolate the healthy under 60, you get less death. And this is actually something that was like for us, it was like, wow. So you're saying that if we actually don't isolate the healthy, you can actually get a better behavior if you are able to isolate the vulnerable. Yes. And you can actually cut the death toll by almost half. This is counterintuitive if you think about it, but it actually makes sense, because if you remember, the IFR for the vulnerables is orders of magnitude higher than the IFR for the healthy, and we know that from New York. So this is like something that is important, and this is the danger, because if no one is looking into this, if no one understands this, how you are going to design the proper response? You can't, because your model is underdetermined. So when you look at this, then we figure out, hey, you know, we can actually measure. So these numbers are saying something. These numbers are saying, hey, you know, if the virus moves through this population first and to this other population later, then what it will happen is that these two populations are going to have different seroprevalence. So I can go and look into the over 60 seroprevalence, which is the amount of antibody positive people that you get in that cohort, and then you can get from the other cohort, and you can actually divide them. When you divide them, essentially what you know is like, if in 0.5, it means that for each 2 healthy, you actually got only a single vulnerable. And these numbers actually correlate directly with the final deaths. That is our first result, is that we can actually convert an underdetermined model into a model that you can actually use this number to get to understand what has been the behavior before. So the problem with the underdetermination is if you don't fight back, it gets worse the more and more that you move forward. So you have to first get rid of it before doing anything. And seroprevalence ratio in our case was the key that allows us to fight underdetermination. So are we there yet to forecast? Sadly, no. I'm going to tell you why overdetermination is important, which is this. There's no way you can actually know what happened in Stockholm and what happened in Madrid. If you look at it, their behavior, if you smooth the curve enough, because essentially the amount of total deaths that you have in Madrid versus Stockholm is 8,000 to 2,000 something. So those ups and downs that you see in there, that in the curve, it can actually be smooth, and you're going to be looking at them and you will say, you know, I don't see anything. And it makes sense. But the thing is, when you go and look at the seroprevalence ratio from Stockholm, you figure out that it's 1.7. And if you look at the Madrid one, you find that 0.79, which means that in Madrid, the virus moved more into the vulnerable cohort than in the healthy cohort, which is inversely to what happened in Stockholm. So based on our model, what would happen is that, hey, you know, Stockholm is going to have a smaller second wave. And it makes sense, because if the deaths come from the cohort that is vulnerable, not from the other one, if you cut the access of the virus to that cohort, you are not going to have deaths. Are we there yet to forecast? Again and again is yes. This time is the one and is for real. We are going to be talking about forecasting now. So, the unknown, our total number of infected individuals from a fully naive population. So, we will call this immunity estimation, because essentially it's a number. We want to know how far we are into the immunity of the population. So, the key of immunity estimation is actually getting the right data. We talked about cases. Cases is a bad choice. Date of reporting is just awful. So the only thing that actually makes sense is to actually have confirmed death by date of death and work backward. So you are trying to understand how many infected that you have based on how many deaths you were able to record. And you will also need high quality seroprevalence study, because if we cannot understand, if we cannot get a good representative sample and understand, okay, this is the seroprevalence ratio, whatever we put in there is going to impact the output of our model. So you need to be very, very careful in the seroprevalence study. You need to figure out, this evidence is actually good. And then what we do is we find the vital parameters that explain all locations. So I'm serious here. We studied 6 different locations, and all those locations can be explained with the same parameters. This is modustollens. This is it. If you can't explain someplace with this setup, then your model is not correct. Okay? And we found, for instance, that even with an R0 of 3.3, you can actually explain all first waves, which is very, very interesting. So let's say that we show you our results. It's like we studied Madrid, we studied Catalonia, Paris, London, Brussels, Stockholm. And we found that, for instance, the amount of death per million that they could have if they actually return to normal life after the first wave is in that table. So as you see here, because the Stockholm immunity estimation is far higher than the rest, and it doesn't have accrued that many deaths, it's actually going to be low. But on the other side, places like Paris that had a lot of deaths by the time, but haven't advanced the immunity, they have far higher numbers. So our conclusion at the time was no location can return to normal life without having a second wave. And actually that happened. No one could even return with, even if not in normal life, without a second wave. So they cannot even escape without going to normal life, less it's even worse. So the reason why you use the seroprevalence ratio is something like this. If you look on the right here, you have our estimation. And this orange is the actual thing that you got there for the second one. But there's something interesting here. The herd immunity threshold is 10% higher now. Why? Because the UK variant. The UK variant is faster, 30% faster. So the actual number, if I'm going to left it for you to actually try, what happens if you change the R0 and you fit it again, Stockholm, with 4.3, which is the estimation of 30% more effectiveness, and you get the result. So you can look it for yourself. And the thing is that if you look at it in deaths per million, so we made our estimation when Madrid had 1,260 deaths per million. And we predicted 2,461. And in the actual one that you got at the end of the second wave, that's 2 days ago, is 2,211. You can say the same thing for Paris. We knew when we did the actual estimation, we said, hey, they have 620 deaths per million. They were actually very, very good if you even compare with the Stockholm. But our prediction for it was like 2,000 something, and see how far that go. So if the virus change, how the estimations change? Because now you have a faster virus, so you need more susceptible people to actually be able to arrive to a place where immunity actually kicks in and stop the epidemic. So see how different the predicted values are. See how fast the Stockholm one goes up. And the reason is because even if Stockholm has that, the problem is that they're overshooting because there's not enough young people in Stockholm. Actually pushes it forward. So, and this is the actual. Remember, this is the case, hey, I'm going normal life. And even what Brussels did, they still got the same amount, the roughly our prediction. Okay? So, now let's talk about something that is very important because it actually impacts. This is measurement theory in a sense. What if there is a virus that doesn't kill anyone? We call the harmless virus. And we mean it. Like the IFR is 0 proof. Because this is a thought experiment, we can actually say, yes, it's like that. So we know this is not true, usually, but let's play along. Let's do the experiment. Let's see what happens. So surprise, if we do that, we have a harmless virus, a virus that doesn't kill anyone. But if we test all deaths, we are gonna find 404, actually that's a good number, deaths per million, with a seroprevalence ratio that we can actually estimate of 0.88. So it's interesting because what happens? What is happening here? What is happening? But there's more surprises. Let's say that on this Madrid population, we actually apply pandemic mitigation. We applied Stockholm mitigations. We are going to be finding 368 deaths per million with a seroprevalence ratio of 0.79. But how that's even possible? We are actually getting different numbers. So we need to understand that what happening here is a probability scale. What is the probability of dying while positive from a virus that does not kill you? So the probability of dying while positive, while the probability of being positive. Okay? So the problem is that the background mortality is actually a confounder. And this is why we started with observational errors, because you can have confounders. So there are two ways one can be positive at time of death. Either you have a PCR positive diagnostic up to some amount of days before death, usually 28. Or it also can happen that, hey, we are using PCR. PCR is a pretty sensitive test. So you can have viral shedding that will cause the PCR negative to be delayed in time. So some people have viral shedding and they finish at 17, some other at 30, and some other at 6 months from now and still positive. But they're not infectious. They're just positive. So what we did was we averaged both, and you remember that part of averaging stuff, okay? So we averaged both in what we called a window of positivity. For that window of positivity, you use 17 days, okay? So when you do that, essentially what you're doing is you're doing a sanity check. If your model doesn't show deaths, even if these confounders are there, because essentially people die from natural causes anyway, you are doing it wrong, okay? So playing around with the parameters of your model to actually find the edge cases where you should use a sanity checks are very, very important, because that actually allows you to get rid of confounders. Because if you do that, you can actually figure out that the probability of dying from other causes multiplied by the dying being positive actually means that 15% of the SARS-CoV-2 positive deaths are actually with the virus. What that means is that they have the virus at time of death, or in the window of positivity, but they didn't actually die from that. And by the estimation, you would say, hey, yeah, but you can put whatever numbers, whatever. So this is what Östergötland, or how it's called in Sweden. They got to their entire the group of deaths. They got 245 deaths, and they actually looked at detail. They audited their deaths. So the actual cost of death. So 60% of the contributing 60% of them have contributing factors, which is comorbidities, which is people that is not healthy. So that's 148 deaths. 25 of those actually where the virus is the dominant cause. This is people that died from the virus without accounting for the comorbidities. And then they found that 15% are related, which are the with. See, if you use an average window of 17 and actually calculate the epidemic behavior of, and you find that it's 15%, and then you go to the data, you have to the evidence. If this number could have been different, it could have required us to actually look into something else. The problem is that's true, and we cannot say that our model is wrong because of that. Okay, so this for us is actually bad if you actually find the 15 unrelated. Because we need more data. We need to be sure, okay? So we need to prove ourselves wrong. So if natural mortality can be a confounder and can also impact the observations, can it impact the immunity estimation? That is something that you have to ask yourself. If you have confounders, how those confounders actually impact your immunity estimation, or whatever magnitude you actually want to model and to test. So how sensitive the model to measurement error? Well, in our case, if you look at it, most of the vital parameters is 0. So let that sink in for a minute. And it's like, you are telling me that on a fitted model, in your model, you can change the vital parameters and you can actually won't impact the immunity estimation. Yes, that's true. And the reason why that's true is because fitted immunity estimation behaves entirely different to what most expect, including the experts. And the reason why is because you actually you have a blueprint of what has transpired. So it's not something that you can actually go and say you are going to change this and that. So all that over-determination of the model actually makes it more stronger to discrepancies. So you can find a lot of things like, hey, if I move the S0, which is the amount of susceptibles, my immunity will change. Yeah, no wonder. If you have less people that is susceptible, your immunity is going to be higher, which is essentially what you find here. Or if you change the IFR of the infection fatality rate of the vulnerable, hey, yes, it's going to change because now you need less vulnerables to actually account for the curve that you're seeing. Okay? So it actually makes sense. But then you look into location. So location parameters actually make more sense because, the amount of population that you have will impact the immunity estimation. Yes, of course. Also, the amount of people over 60 is going to impact your immunity estimation because the most of the vulnerable come from that cohort. And there are a few other things in there that you can actually look into our paper in the appendix 1 and 2. But the idea was actually to show you how unexpected is that, for instance, vital parameters do not impact this. They do not impact the estimation. So this allowed us to actually be able to, this overdetermination would allow us to actually play what-if scenarios. It's like if you say, I have the Madrid population, and I have a second wave with normal life, and I'm going to have a seroprevalence of 0.79, I could get roughly 2,500 deaths per million. But if instead of that, I would have started with a Sweden-like mitigation, where the seroprevalence ratio is not gonna be 1.7, but it's gonna be 1.55, you could actually go to 1,700, which is pretty interesting because it's telling you something. It's allowing you to explore what would have happened. So if we can estimate what if based on evidence, because seroprevalence essentially is evidence, if we would have had this parameter, we could say, can we actually find optimal strategies? And the thing is, yes, you can, and you can go back in March where the response started. Up to that point, the virus was behaving as is without any restrictions. And then you can say, yeah, I'm going to look at find for optimal strategies. So the objective of an optimal strategy is always to return to normal life, right? There's no other objective. So that's what we call death minimizing strategies, and we have done a lot of work regarding that. But essentially, the outcome from it is that Sweden on the first wave was close but not optimal. That's why they have that second wave, a small second wave that you found that happened on the second wave. And we have played different scenarios, like what would have happened if we are doing this from back in March, or what would have happened if we say, yeah, we are going to be okay. We messed up, but we are here. What if we do 90 days of death minimizing? And then we go to normal life. Or, we are going to do 90 days of death minimizing, and then we are going to relax all isolation for the healthy. And then you got another different number, which is here. Okay? So, this is essentially what you're looking at. It's a game. This is game theory. Is okay, what would have happened if I would have done this and that, and given that I have an overspecified model that is able to describe the behavior of different places in the world. So, interesting here, what you will find here is that the death minimizing actually requires negative values for the healthy, which means not only you want to relax the healthy, we actually, this is interesting, we actually set it to 0 originally. It took us like 15 days to figure out, hey, we can actually let the death minimizing algorithm to find solutions with negative, which means what it means, that's coronavirus parties. Okay, so essentially what it's saying here is that, you want to minimize death, you need coronavirus parties. It's like if you, the optimal solution for a rich country is organize a good stock thing and just send every below 20 first there, and then a week later figure out, hey, we have to send the under 30 now, and then the under 40, and in that way you essentially are minimizing death. But the problem is it's not ethical. Okay, so there's a very, very important detail here, is that your model can tell you something that may not be ethical to do it. Okay, so this is what's where it gets really, really tricky. So now the question is, okay, now we have vaccines. Yes, we can do something. Now, can we find optimal strategies even having vaccines in the mix? Yes, and that is what is called the vaccine gamble. From game theory, you can actually say, hey, a gamble on the expectation of final deaths. Essentially, we are trying to minimize death. So we want to understand the expectation. And interestingly, this problem can actually be solved through an oracle mechanism. Essentially, you're telling the system, hey, there's an oracle that knows when a vaccine is going to be available. So we are going to try every single potential day of vaccination, and we are going to have this assumption for vaccines. They are 100% effective. So after the moment that you vaccinate someone, immediately there are no more deaths from the virus, and also it can be inoculated to the entire population in just one day. So someone can argue there is no better scenario for a vaccine. It's like, this is the very best thing. It's impossible, but it's the very best. Okay? So this is what happens. If you look at it, if you look at what happened after the first wave, you figure out, hey, even a vaccine after November is actually suboptimal to a death minimizing trajectory, to a death minimizing strategy. So this is the interesting thing. If you know that the vaccine is going to take you years, you have a faster way to achieve the same goal. This is probably our most important result. So the question is, and someone's going to ask, hey, why are you so sure? What if you're wrong? What if it is actually more lethal than we estimated? The problem is, if it's more lethal, is that if you actually go to the equations and you figure out, and you can actually go and try it, death minimizing are even more important than it was now, because the difference between the vulnerable and the healthy are going to become bigger. So it's actually more important to actually segregate the healthy from the vulnerable while the virus is in circulation. So I'm going to leave you a final thought about this, and is, can an Ebola patient actually avoid mandatory isolation? Because Ebola is it's a very, very hard disease, and it's something that, if someone has Ebola, you have to isolate them. But why do I pose this extreme question? Because the actual problem is very, very old. It's not new. Mary Mallon in the 80s has a problem. She was actually a chronic typhoid fever patient. It actually required a ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States. And the more important thing, it's not the only case. So there are many like her. But to actually solve this problem, if you actually want to try solving this problem, you need to understand there are many extremes. You have, for instance, Bubble Boy. Bubble Boy have a compromised immune system, so cannot damage anyone, because if he actually gets any pathogen, it damages him. And you have the other side, which is the chronic typhoid fever, but we use the chronic Ebola to that, in the where he actually damaged everyone. Nobody damages him because he's immune to it, but he damaged anyone he's in contact with. And then you have the novel virus, where you don't even know the damage function, which was our case back in March. We actually found a potential solution to this problem, and we discussed it in our paper, which is the isolation exception in SEIRS. So essentially, what you actually understand here is that this is an interplay of third parties trying to figure out what that function is. And we can actually talk about it more later in the discussion some if you want, because I'm running out of time. But the idea behind this is that you actually pay an insurance because you may cause damage if you are exempted from isolation. So you can actually go and say, hey, I'm going to be paying for my isolation. Because I'm sure going to be damaging someone, though that one that is gonna get damaged needs to be repaired in a sense. So in a sense, it's the same thing that what happens when you have an insurance for your car when for third parties. You cannot go out with an insurance, and that's more or less the idea. But I'm going to be telling you just one more thing, because you don't know, you don't guess. I haven't forgotten about this one. I just said it from right there, but I haven't got it. So you remember this case. Now that you have observed a lot of things, I'm going to ask you again. What can we say about the distribution of virus present on the part of the sample that is untypified? Did they all grow at the same rate as influenza? Because we measured influenza. Do both years have the same hidden distribution on the other side? Because, let's face it, we don't know. Do all viruses find immunity weaknesses all at once? Interesting also. It's an interesting biological question. And the last one is, did you really think this was actually hypothetical? Because, well, it was not. This is exactly what happens on the 2019 Australian tsunami, but it was not just Australia. It was the entire Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Myanmar, New Zealand. Everywhere you see, you find record influenza-like illnesses on 2019. But you know what? When you go and measure, your surveillance system says it's not an out of ordinary year. Why this can happen? Because if you don't know what is on the hidden part of the distribution, you're going to be assuming something. And one thing that you should know, you never assume the distribution of variables you don't measure. Because when you do so, you're assuming something that is very, very, very strong. So what I'm saying here is you can actually go and look into Appendix 3, and we have a solution or some hypothesis that actually makes sense for why COVID-19 was actually being able to be controlled through non-pharmaceutical interventions in the Pacific Rim, let's say Oceania and Asia, and it wasn't being able to be done in any other place, including Europe, including America. So with this, I leave you to, if you want to actually understand more about this, is you can have some references here. You can ask me directly on Twitter, and I can respond to you about that. So with this, I'm closing, and I'm thanking you for coming. And I will be at the discussion zone for all the time that you need to have your questions answered. So thank you very much, and I'll see you there in a few minutes.
Hey, Federico, thank you so much for this talk. It was so awesome and exciting. I have learned a lot about epidemiology and coronavirus. And currently we have time for a few questions. So, based on the results of your work, it would be easy to say that we had been more infected people that we have accounted for.
Yes, essentially, that's what probably one of our, let's put it this way, more interesting results early on. Is like when you work backward from the death series, what you will find is that the amount of infected individuals that you should have based on epidemic dynamics is definitely not the ones that you will find when you actually look at the cases series. And that's interesting because essentially what would happen is that you go to any place in the world that you want to actually look at, and it happens in all of them. So it's not a fluke in a way. But this is an anecdote, and I'm saying anecdote. I said it in the slide, in the early slides. I said anecdote from even coming from an expert in the field has absolutely zero value as evidence, but it will illustrate the point. I had in my own house, in my own family, a case where my mother-in-law, which is 75 years old, and my father-in-law, which is who is 84. Actually, my mother-in-law had fainted in the bathroom, having diarrhea, and ended up in the hospital. So it's not like, hey, it was a case like, who knows? It's a simple thing, but it was never treated as a coronavirus case, and at the time I had the data directly from this location because it's in my country. So the very first thing that you could do is you get the data from your country. And I can say a lot of things about my country, but not that they didn't give me the data, the dump of the data. It's probably one of the better places to actually get the real data out from. They have lag, they have a lot of problems, but at least they give you the data. And at that time, I told my wife, which is also she's a biochemist. It's like she works in the hospital. She actually is the one that does the PCR tests. So it's kind of like she have the knowledge. She's a specialist in the medicine and evidence-based medicine. So, and I told her, our model says that on your father's location, on your mother's location, it's exactly in the middle of the epidemic. It's really going to the top in the next few weeks. And I was like, no, it's impossible because the symptoms were not inequivocal, and that's why I make so much emphasis on that. The thing is that then his father actually got something that it was diagnosed as anorexia nervosa, which he essentially couldn't actually eat. So he was very weak because he couldn't eat for weeks. And you would say, that's not coronavirus, that's not SARS-CoV-2. And I'm going to tell you, probably. But what happened? 4 months later, they said, okay, it is time for vaccinating. And I said, wait a minute. Because you had that now with 4 months, I can tell you, your peak was around that time, as I was saying. And the thing is that I'm a gambler. So I make a gamble with my wife, and I said, let's do something. I'm gonna gamble you. Your mother and your father had SARS-CoV-2, and you are going to let me this thing that it was this picture that was a problem of contention there, that it wasn't going to come here. And it was like, okay, if I'm right, I'm going to hang it there in the computer room. Okay, fine. And the thing is that you don't know the answer. And do you know how many of the cases in that household were actually recorded for the statistics?
Zero.
And that's exactly the case. You're talking about a disease that can actually masquerade into other diseases. So it's very difficult to actually have a clear understanding of the amount of infected individuals, because essentially you don't detect them. But it's not something that is new. We knew that back in March. Not March, in April, when the first prevalence studies came out. It was obvious. And at some point, you have to say, okay, yes, if the numbers do not add up for a gambler, for someone that has made a career in measuring stuff, then the question is why they fail. So we spent 6 months trying to figure out why they failed, and this is the return, and this is the result. They failed because our systems are too tuned for measuring stuff that essentially doesn't make any sense when you try to understand an ongoing epidemic. They work afterwards. When you already had the epidemic and I'm going to be looking into something, and it actually makes a lot of sense, but not while you are in it. This is the interesting part. It's like we don't have systems in place that allows us to catch these abnormalities when they are happening.
Okay.
So that's
yes, so unfortunately we don't have any more time. So I want to invite you to the discussion zone. And I suggest to continue with now another question. So people ask about what the probability are that we vaccinate people that has not been previously detected. And is it a good thing to vaccinate people that were infected? And what are your thoughts about this topic? So I suggest starting the whole discussion, the discussion zone, from this specific question. You could join the room and start answering once you discover some people who also join the room, and I will join you a few minutes later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, everybody. Obviously, you can ask whatever, and I will try to ask the parts that I can. I already going to say that probably I'm not the best person to respond the part of the question of what to do, but I can answer the other part of the question, which is yes, we are essentially vaccinating people that probably some of them already had it, and I don't know. It's something that it should be analyzed essentially. I asked this question to people that knows this kind of stuff, and they said clearly the response was, if you are going to be vaccinating someone, is to elicit an immune response, and if you are going to if you are in contact with the virus, you're essentially eliciting an immune response. And essentially, what most of them said to me is that you can figure out the rest. So that's about it.
Yeah, from here, I suggest to continue to the discussion in the discussion zone. So thank you very much one more time, and see you in a few minutes.